Although the Maastricht Treaty founding the European Union had been signed by all the participating nations, it still needed to be ratified by the various national parliaments, and an early spanner was thrown in the works when a referendum in Denmark on the subject rejected the treaty by a razor-thin majority of 50.7%, or just under 47,000 votes. Up to this point, the leaders of the member states had agreed matters between themselves, and only 3 member states had decided to organise a referendum on the ratification of the treaty: Denmark, Ireland and France. The results of the Danish vote suggested that the push for greater European integration wasn't as universally popular as had been assumed, and the results of the Irish and French votes could yet see the whole process screech to a halt. The following day, the city of Rio de Janeiro hosted the Earth Summit, officially the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which sums up its purpose. The idea was to take advantage of the end of the Cold War and a new mood of optimism to encourage the world's nations to work together on the big issues facing the globe: pollution and climate change, water supply and biodiversity, but also social issues such as global poverty. The summit yielded the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, established a body called the Conference of the Parties, COP, which would meet annually to discuss climate change and what to do about it. Of course, creating frameworks and discussion bodies is one thing, but actually getting anything done is always difficult, and critics have pointed out ever since how few of the agreements have actually been met. And the 1992 European Football Championship kicked off in Sweden, with the hosts drawing 1-1 with France on the opening day, and last-minute replacements Denmark playing out a rather dull 0-0 draw with England. The 2 most fancied teams in the group, France and England, had another goalless draw a few days later, while Sweden squeaked a 1-0 win over their neighbours to go into the last game on top of the group. Despite the dramas going on at home, the USSR had qualified for the tournament at the expense of Italy, but since it didn't exist anymore, a decision was made that just for this one tournament, the Soviet Union team that had qualified together could compete together before each of the constituent republics started playing separately. The team was renamed the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, which was the looser body that had replaced the USSR. It was also tactfully ignored that while Georgia had declined to join the new body, there was one Georgian player in the squad, the remainder being mostly Russians with a couple of Ukrainians and a Belarusian. The former Soviet team lined up for its first game against Germany, which was in its first tournament as a unified nation, and nearly won, with Thomas Hessler sparing German brushes with a late equaliser, while the Dutch scraped past Scotland 1-0. The Scots were then beaten 2-0 by Germany, while the Netherlands and CIS played out a 0-0 draw. The final set of group games would be played the week after the Canadian Grand Prix, with nobody definitely out yet, though Scotland had a bit of work to do. And so we move on to the Canadian Grand Prix, where once again we have Rob Hurley to thank for his excellent footage of the practice and qualifying sessions, sadly for the last time. There were more backstage shenanigans in between races, as there was another meeting that would have seemed unthinkable not long ago. Bernie Eccleston held a meeting of FOCA at Maranello, though some teams, Lotus, Ligier, Brabham and March, declined to attend. Bernie had watched the TV audiences fall off a cliff since the start of the season, and most would agree that Mansell's dominance was the reason. At least in 1988, even if McLaren were winning every race, Senna and Prost were racing against each other to keep things interesting. So Bernie brought out his desired rules changes again: refuelling, or at least a mandatory tyre stop, a single pump fuel formula, widen the chassis and narrow the rear tyres. He seemed to be winning people round, but to nobody's great surprise, Frank Williams felt this whole thing was aimed at him and declined to sign off, and the Concord Agreement required unanimity, so that appeared to be that. While FOCA was meeting at Maranello, Guy Ligier was a bit busy, fighting off a hostile takeover bid from Jean-Paul Driot, boss of the Dams F3000 team. Along with industrialist François Lafont, Driot showed up in the paddock as the team were unpacking in Canada, while Guy Ligier was still back in France. Fortunately, team manager Danny Hidenoch had his head screwed on the right way round and made some calls, while French government minister and Mitterrand ally Jean Glavany also happened to be on hand to lend them some heft. Driot and Lafont left without the title deeds in their pocket, but Guy Ligier probably hadn't heard the last of this. The other missing teams were having their own problems too. Both Brabham and March were catastrophically short of cash. The Middlebridge group was tens of millions in debt and about to go bankrupt, with the Brabham team kept alive by the money from Landhurst Leasing, a shady pawnbroking outfit that had also advanced some money to Lotus. Dennis Nursey managed to arrange a one-off sponsorship for Canada by Japanese rock group BMS, while the returning John MacDonald brought a few small sponsors with him. Over at March, a desperate Ken Marable put a small ad in a local Montreal paper and created something of a news story. Local businesses donated a total of $45,000 in exchange for putting their stickers on the car, and there was a certain amount of media interest in the team for race day too. Andrea Moda should have been looking forward to Canada after the boost in morale from the Miracle of Monaco, but things are never that simple for Andrea Sassetti. First of all, one of his nightclubs was the subject of an arson attack, and when he escaped the building he was shot at. And then his engines failed to show up in Montreal. Allegedly, because of a storm, the aircraft scheduled to take them had to leave them behind to save weight, though nobody was entirely ruling out foul play. At any rate, the team borrowed a Judd V8 from Brabham, which was very nice of them given their own circumstances, and fitted it to Moreno's car, with McCarthy being told to go kick rocks for the weekend. All that was enough for Frederick Dano, who quit the team after just 6 weeks as sporting director. There was some good news for a small team though. The Fonmetal team debuted their new car, the GRO2. Drawn up by Sergio Rinland's Astauto Bureau with aerodynamics by Hans Fuchs, the GRO2 looked great with the now de rigueur anhedral front wing attached to a needle-like nose, and given Tarquini's qualifying heroics in the old car so far, there were hopes that the team could start to crack the top 10 and even score points. For Canada, there was just one example for Tarquini, but Chiesa would get his own at the next race in France. Canada was marking the 10th anniversary of the death of Gilles Villeneuve, and like the Italian Tifosi, the Canadian Ferrari faithful had taken Jean Alesi to their hearts as his spiritual successor. Jean, for his part, seemed rather distracted. For one thing, he was still angry about Schumacher's move on him in Monaco, and the two were pointedly ignoring each other. For another thing, he was getting married a week after the race, so he had other things on his mind, and the car still wasn't great. With no race in the US this year, some of the stars of IndyCar were in attendance too, with Mario and Michael Andretti both there, along with Indy 500 winner Al Unser Jr. Both Michael and Little Al seemed keen to get into F1. Andretti had already been linked with several teams, had a test with McLaren, and Ron Dennis had been spotted with him at the Indy 500, while Unser had spoken to both Briatore and Williams. And of course Michael Andretti was therefore the latest driver to be measured up for Ivan Capelli's seat by the Italian motoring press. As to this year, Williams was still using the RS4 engine in qualifying, but not quite trusting it with a full race distance. Benetton was sticking with the Series 6 V8 for the race too, more flexible, said team manager Joan Villadel-Prat, while Yamaha had reduced the already low power of their engine to try and make it last the distance. Eddie Jordan was said to be desperately looking for a new engine supplier for 1993. Perry McCarthy's lack of an engine meant that there was only one car to be eliminated from pre-qualifying, and under the circumstances it was no great surprise when Roberto Moreno failed to repeat his Monaco heroics and instead was over 18 seconds adrift, with Alboreto and Gasho close together and the rookies Katayama and Chiesa coming in instalments afterwards. And so to Friday qualifying, where there was a surprise. Senna was fastest, then Patrese, then Berger, then Mansell down in fourth. Rumour was that Mansell was unhappy at the team, who was said to be negotiating with Alain Prost for 1993, but for whatever reason he seemed out of sorts. Mansell went fastest in Saturday's session, but with the track slowing a bit, he couldn't beat either Senna or Patrese's Friday times and would line up third, the first time he hadn't been on pole all year. Berger was fourth, Schumacher fifth, and Johnny Herbert was a fantastic sixth ahead of Brundle, with the Ferraris back in an unhappy 8th and 9th, and Hakkinen lining up 10th. I can't be bothered looking up the last time Lotus qualified two cars in the top 10, but it was a while ago. Ukio Katayama was also impressive in 11th in the Venturi, just ahead of Wendlinger in the newly sponsored March. Tarquini put the new Fonmetal 18th ahead of Gasho, who might have done better without transmission problems, and Belmondo, who had an oil leak. The Ligiers remained all at 6s and 7s, with Boutsen still complaining of a lack of grip and Comas blowing an engine, and the rear was brought up by Fittipaldi's Minardi, the new car still just not really working, and Guiar's Tyrrell. Missing out were Aguri Suzuki, who'd told reporters that he still didn't really understand the car and had a series of spins and excursions, Andrea Chiesa, and both Brabhams. Stefano Modena would start from the back after his Jordan's detuned Yamaha failed to fire on the grid, and in overcast but warm and humid weather, the rest lined up on their grid slots with a high attrition rate expected and the legend Salut Gilles now painted on the start-finish line. The lights went green and Senna made the perfect start as Mansell tried to slingshot between him and Patrese but had to be satisfied with second, with Berger fourth, and Herbert and Brundle fighting for sixth, and Hakkinen trying to take ninth off Capelli. Herbert got the better of his veteran compatriot as Mansell dodged this way and that looking for a way past Senna, while Capelli had dropped behind both Hakkinen and Wendlinger as the first lap continued. The new Fond Metal wouldn't see the end of that lap though, its transmission a goner before it even got halfway round. So at the end of the lap it was Senna, Mansell, Patrese, Berger, Schumacher and Brundle who'd got back past Herbert, with Hakkinen behind him, having got past Alesi. There was a coming together between teammates in the midfield as 14th placed Gasho tried to make a move on his teammate Katayama and wiped off his front wing, coming in for a replacement. Senna was keeping the pace reasonably low, unlike Mansell who tended to put the hammer down early, and the top 8 were continuing to run together as the race settled down from its initial few laps. Gasho had another mishap on lap 13, bounced into the wall at the hairpin by Guiar. In an awkward spot, the marshals pushed him out of the way, allowing the Venturi to restart, only to be disqualified for getting a push start. Mansell, meanwhile, had hung back a bit to get ready for another attack on Senna, and started to do so on lap 14. But, in an incident missed by the TV cameras, he seemed to brake far too late for the last chicane, bounced across the gravel trap, and spun to a halt on the middle of the start-finish straight. Patrese chucked out the anchors to avoid hitting his teammate, and Berger took the opportunity to nab second. Mansell was still in his cockpit when the leaders came back around feeling some back pain and was helped out by the marshals, but whatever was wrong didn't stop him calling in at the McLaren garage on his way back to his own to tear a strip off Ron Dennis for Senna's blocking. Unnoticed among all the drama, Maurizio Gugelmin's race ended with a broken transmission. So the leading pack of 8 was now a slightly reshuffled leading pack of 7, with a feisty-looking Berger following Senna close behind and showing every sign that he wanted to get past, and Alesi had caught up to Hakkinen a little and was trying to attach himself to the back of the pack. Mansell's car was stuck in gear, and there was no crane near enough, so the stricken Williams remained on the starting grid near the pit wall for the time being. Brundle, who'd gone second fastest in the warm-up that morning, was all over the back of Schumacher like a rash, as Senna approached the first of the back markers, Fittipaldi's Minardi, on lap 18. Ivan Capelli's rear suspension gave way at turn 4 a lap later, pitching the unfortunate Italian into the wall pretty hard, his helmet actually bouncing off the concrete. Dazed but unhurt, Ivan got out and climbed through a hole in the fence he'd conveniently landed next to. Still just one finish for Capelli so far, if you don't count his classified finish at Imola, which the fans wouldn't, since he'd crashed out right in front of them well within spitting distance of the points. A tow truck came out onto the track to get the Ferrari, as was common in North American racing, and a crane finally arrived to get Mansell's Williams out of the way too. As the first half of the race developed, the top 5 began to pull away from Herbert, who was in turn pulling away from Hakkinen in 7th. With half distance approaching, Senna lapped a little group of back markers led by Paul Belmondo, who had been racing heroically in 15th to keep Boots and Leto, Griard and Modena behind him. Olivier had apparently had a fatherly conversation with veteran driver and Eurosport commentator John Watson during the weekend and practically leaped out of the way as everyone came piling through. Maybe it was just because Mansell wasn't there. Once they were clear of Belmondo, Berger was back to piling on the pressure, with Patrese and the Benettons still close behind. Brundle putting up a fastest lap as he continued pushing Schumacher all the way. Having done so well so far, Paul Belmondo had a bit of an off-track excursion and had to come in for new boots. On the stroke of half-time, Herbert's Lotus toured into the pits, his clutch gone, and on the very next lap Hakkinen was rolling to a stop with a box full of neutrals, both low tie out after such a promising start, but the team could be encouraged with the form of their new car, and at least they were in good company because just 2 laps later the leading McLaren suddenly pulled over, Senna's electrics having just cut out on him. There had been only 5 retirements up to that point too, so the race was now between the 2 number 2s of Berger and Patrese, with Benetton again scenting a potential win if anything happened to both of them. All of which moved Alesi up into 5th and elevated Karl Wendlinger in the march into the points. Berger put his foot down, disposing quickly of Morbidelli, but when Schumacher came up to lap the Minardi, he got crowded out and Brundle pounced, going up to third. As Schumacher chased his teammate, presumably turning the air inside his helmet a lovely shade of blau, Patrese was starting to drop away from Berger a bit. Gerhard was certainly gunning it, setting the fastest lap, but Ricciardo was also having gear problems of his own, missing fourth. And when he lost fifth too, he had no choice but to let the Benettons through and peel into the pits. Another retirement, and Williams' first double DNF of the year. It was their 250th Grand Prix, and Lotus's 450th, and it wasn't exactly one for the scrapbook in either case. So, Brundle was up to second, and within spitting distance of his maiden win. And he wasn't just relying on Berger breaking down or stopping for tyres either, though Gerhard was notoriously hard on rubber, but he was really pushing his car, working perfectly as he set about trying to reel in the gap. Until it wasn't working perfectly, his transmission packing up after 45 laps. So in just 8 laps, Senna, Patrese and Brundle had all dropped out of a podium place with technical gremlins. So, Berger now led Schumacher by about 8 seconds, with Alesi another 20 seconds back in a rather distant third, Wendlinger 7 seconds behind the Ferrari in fourth, followed by Katayama, De Cesaris and Comas all covered by about 20 seconds in fifth, sixth and seventh. Berger was having gearbox problems of his own, in fact. He had a fast return switch to drop him straight from sixth to first for the slow corners, and it had stopped working. All it meant was that he had to shift down through the gears one by one, which wasn't the end of the world, but he wasn't used to doing it, and it meant he couldn't keep pushing his lap times. And he was also being a bit more circumspect about looking after his car. It also meant that Schumacher could close, whittling the gap down as the race entered the last 15 laps. Eric Comas and Michele Alboreto, meanwhile, were having the best scrap on the track at this stage, even if it was only over 7th place, though with the big boys dropping like flies today, it could well end up being a race over points by the end. The veteran Alboreto, with 5 race wins and a 2nd place in the championship under his belt, was really having at sophomore Comas in the Ligier, but just couldn't get through. Schumacher's pursuit of Berger was frustrated by Belmondo getting in the way, and the Frenchman was given a wave for his trouble, but while the famous actor's son was no doubt here by virtue of wallet rather than talent, he was also struggling with the fading brakes on the march. Katayama was looking good for a maiden 2 points and another big boost for Venturi LaRousse until his engine spectacularly let go with just 7 laps to go. So De Cesaris took over 5th place in the Tyrrell, with Comas 6th. He'd managed to shake Alboreto from his rear wing, and when De Cesaris started dropping back with fading brakes and a broken exhaust, Eric got his foot down and gave chase, with Alboreto, now with a point to chase, back on his heels again. Up front, though, things were less dramatic, and Berger cruised home without too much drama to take his 7th career win and his first McLaren win that wasn't a charity case. Schumacher came in second, with Alesi a fine third to appease the Canadian fans, even if they hadn't seen anything particularly gung-ho from him. Wendlinger took a fine and popular 4th place to give all those small Canadian sponsors their money's worth, with De Cesaris hanging on to 5th with a dying Elmore engine, and Comas holding off Alboreto to take Ligier's first point since France 1989 and Eric's own first point in F1 to boot. There was a brief heart-stopping moment when Charlie Whiting's scrutineers found Berger's front wing end plates were a few millimetres over the prescribed overhang, but having been satisfied that it had been an assembly error and hadn't made any difference to performance, it was allowed and Gerhard had his win. And there were Austrian smiles around the paddock as it had been some time since they had 2 drivers in the top 6. So with Mansell, Senna and Patrese all retiring, it was the turn of Berger and Schumacher to make hay, with the German closing to within 2 points of 2nd place Patrese, and the Austrian getting back on equal points with Senna, while McLaren were able to pull away a little from Benetton and shave just a little off that still enormous gap to Williams. The inquest into Nigel Mansell's accident would of course be the big takeaway from the race, with Mansell still vocally criticising Senna, who refused to rise to it, and the international motoring press being rather more sceptical. The only man who can prevent Nigel winning the title is Nigel, was the prevailing view. Next up was France, and the return to the Magny-Cours circuit, which had had its debut last year. It would mark the halfway point of the season, after which Prix qualifying would be reassessed, assuming it was still needed, of course, because there were strong rumours that after the latest problems on and off track, Andrea Moda might not make it.